Okay, muchachos. So we have verbos de cambio radical. This is our one of our more common types of irregular verbs, but it's irregular in a different way than those that we've worked with. So what we call them is stem change verbs, and we call them E to IE because we're going to change the E within the verbs to an IE in certain conjugations. So we're going to see what that means. We're going to break it down with several verbs so that we can see that. As we do this, you can be filling out the E to IE stem change verb worksheet. Okay, so the very first part, it'll have you kind of break it down and fill in those spaces within so we can differentiate which ones we make the stem change and which subjects we don't. So our overall goal is students will be able to conjugate stem change verbs. We also call them boot verbs, and you'll see why we call them boot verbs as we go through them. So you're also making those necessary changes depending on the subject. That's where we're going to get whether we do the stem change or not. Like I said, these are some of our more common irregular verbs. And so we're going to see two types. We'll start with this type, and next week we'll add one more type of stem change verb. And so we'll get into it. So as we look at our checklist, we've done vocabulario de fútbol. We're moving on here to verbos de cambio radical e a ie, and we'll move on from there. All right, so let's review. Repasamos las conjugaciones regulares. We did this yesterday as well, but for example, we have hablar. We take off the AR, we decide the subject, and we add the ending as in yo hablo. Meter, as in meter un gol. We take off the ER, we decide what's the subject, and add the necessary ending as in tú metes. And then we have abrir, which is to open. Take off the IR, we ask what's the subject, we add the necessary ending. In this case, that'll be usted abre, right? So that's our pattern. That pattern will remain the same with these verbs, okay? So our endings are going to be regular. What's going to be irregular is what goes in between the beginning and ending of our verbs, okay? So again, AR verbs, here's our endings as a review. That's our AR. Here's our ER, O, S, E, hemos, en, and then our IR, very similar, O, S, E, hemos, en. All right, so stem change verbs are when we take part of the inside of the verb and we make some changes, some alterations. For all of the stem change verbs, the endings, like I said, are going to be regular. So just what we just reviewed, the endings will be right. What's irregular is what's inside. As a note, many of our stem change verbs can and will commonly be used as part of infinitive expressions. And so as we go through these slides, what you're going to notice is it'll tell you exactly if there's a trigger. Some of these don't have a trigger, and so we can put the infinitive right after the first conjugated verb. So we're going to start with this verb, empezar, which means to start or to begin, okay? So we want to notice, where are we making a change? Yo empiezo. Tú empiezas. Mario empieza. Nosotros empezamos. Vosotros empezáis. Ellos empiezan. Okay. So as we look at it, here's an example. Our infinitive expression trigger for this, just like with ir, is a. Yo empiezo, sorry, let that get out of the way. Empiezo a estudiar a las 5. So as we look at this, okay, when we say they are E to IE stem change verbs, what happens is everything inside this boot, this is why we call it a boot verb, everything inside there is where we're going to see an E that changes to an IE. So when we look at the infinitive, it's empezar, that for all of the subjects within this boot is going to change to IE. Everything outside stays in E, as in nosotros empezamos and vosotros empezáis. Okay? Take note again that our endings are regular. What's irregular is what is outside or inside of the verb. Here's another, perder. We know perder, to lose. Okay? Yo pierdo, tú pierdes. Mario pierde. Nosotros perdemos. Vosotros perdés. Ellos pierden. And here's an example. Tú pierdes el partido de fútbol. Okay. And there's our boot, right? Everything inside the boot, that E in our infinitive is changing to IE. Next verb is preferir. Preferir, that's a cognate, to prefer, okay? So we have example, yo prefiero, tú prefieres, Mario prefiere, nosotros preferimos, vosotros preferís, ellos prefieren. Couple of notes here. Note that there are two E's. We are making the stem change in the second E. Okay, and so we can see our boot here to see what is changing. Everything outside of the boot remains the same. Also note that we do not have a trigger for our infinitive expression. And so if we are going to use two verbs in a row with preferir, and preferir is the first, all we have to do is put that infinitive right after. So example, Mario prefiere comer almuerzo en casa. Mario prefers to eat lunch at home. All right, two more verbs. Pensar. Pensar, to think. Okay, so again, we're looking at what's inside the boot. Okay, those are three. Yo pienso, tú piensas, Mario piensa, and then we take note of what's outside of the boot. Nosotros pensamos, vosotros pensáis, and then our one plural form inside the boot. Ellos piensan, as in nosotros pensamos que el béisbol es el mejor deporte. We think that baseball is the best sport. Okay, and there's our boot. Well, again, that one's a little more detailed there. We don't have a lot of uses for pensar in an infinitive expression, at least not now, and so there's no need to talk about our trigger. Now, this is the most common that we're going to see. That's a stem change verb, and that is querer. Querer, to want. Okay, so we see our forms. Yo quiero. Tú quieres. Mario quiere. Nosotros queremos. Vosotros queréis. Ellos quieren. This is another where our trigger does not need an infinitive, or we don't have a trigger for our infinitive expression, so we conjugate the first and put the infinitive right after. Ellos quieren ir a Costa Rica. They want to go to Costa Rica. And again, here's our example. That's a nice boot there. Okay, everything inside the boot, we change the E in the middle to IE. Everything outside of the boot, we keep the E the same. We don't make that stem change. Okay. All right, so let's get into some practice. You can kind of be doing it in your head as we go here. We have Mario wants. So we know we're going to use querer. Okay, so we have Mario quiere. We think, right? We always know that we is going to be outside of the boot. So our nosotros form for the verb pensar will be nosotros pensamos, no stem change. They, as in all girls, prefer. So we know we're using the verb preferir, and we'll use the subject ellas. This is inside of that boot, so we make our stem change on the first E, or on the second E, excuse me. Ellas prefieren. Right there in the middle, that stem change. I lose. The yo form is always inside the boot for our stem change verbs. So for our verb perder, in the subject yo, we have yo pierdo. You, informal, start or begin. So we know we're using the verb empezar, also within the boot, always on our stem change verbs. So in empezar, that E in the middle will change to tú empiezas. Okay, within that boot. All right, so looking at our checklist. Verbos de cambio radical. This is our first that we'll talk about. Next week, we'll bring in a second set of verbs that follow a O to UE pattern. Okay, but for now we'll focus on this type and these 5 verbs: empezar, preferir, perder, pensar, and querer.